Daniel Rivers, and today I'm going to be giving a presentation on the Colosseum purely in regards to its ancient Roman aspects. So before we can begin to discuss the Colosseum, we should know what it is. And basically the Colosseum was this massive arena built by Romans to serve as a place that could home things like theatrical plays, gladiator matches, and public executions. And so its official construction was completed finally in about 82 AD. And so as the Colosseum itself finds its initial origins under the command of Emperor Vespasian. He returned a conqueror. He had recently just got back from quelling a massive Jewish rebellion that had started back in 66 AD. And so as he returned a hero, and eventually the Emperor of Rome, one of his first things that he wanted to do was to move away from this idea and history that had been left by Nero. And so Nero himself, before he had eventually moved to commit suicide, had set part of Rome aside and had created what is referred to as his Golden House, which was a massive palace set aside for he and his administration. And so one of the first things that Vespasian moved to do is to move away from Nero. He had a massive segment of the Golden House refitted and reconstructed to be turned into what he at the time referred to as the Flavian Amphitheater. And so there was this idea behind this, not only to construct this Colosseum per se, or this amphitheater for the Roman people, but also to use, as I mentioned before, he was a returning conqueror and he had just come home from a victorious war, so he wanted to move towards this idea that Rome should be for the people and not just the aristocracy. So he wanted to use the spoils of war that he had brought back with him, not just for the soldiers and for the military and for the nobles, but also for the Roman people. So he constructed this Colosseum and also wanted to use the spoils of war earned by Rome for the Romans. As we can see right here, this is just a picture of what the Colosseum itself would have looked like in its prime. So the Colosseum itself was initially built as a quote-unquote people's pleasure palace. It was also a political move initially by Vespasian and an attempt to move away and ultimately try to forget what Nero had done to the empire itself. And so unfortunately it ended up having the exact opposite effect as we all know, we don't refer to it as the Vespasian Amphitheater, but generally by the Colosseum. And the Colosseum itself, that actual title gets its name from the existence of, at the time, what was a nearby massive statue of Nero that was referred to as the Colossus. And so, aside from its actual political intentions, the Colosseum itself would, as we mentioned before, would be home to things like the gladiatorial battles, the plays, and public executions. And so, to try and understand why this was, considered entertainment for the Roman people, you have to start to understand, while today this might be considered immoral and obviously against the law, there was very few things that the ancient Roman loved more than a spectacular showing of violence and bloodshed. What better way for a man to die than in battle? And so this served as a fantastic source of entertainment for the ancient Romans. I've seen a lot of sources as far as how big and as far as how many people it was able to hold, and sources say it was able to hold anywhere from 50,000 to 100,000 people during its prime. And so other uses of the Colosseum, aside from the ones that we've talked about, which are a little bit more common, would also be for an actual medium for the emperor or any member of the aristocracy to the people themselves. A lot of their work would be done behind closed doors, but when you start to think of the Colosseum, this was a way for them to host events, whether it be for religions or for anniversaries or political ascensions. This gave them a direct opportunity to directly speak with their people and communicate with them in person. And so another function of the Colosseum itself, because of its size and its complexity, it allowed it to be flooded, so it could be used to stage things like either actual mock battles in naval battles for the military themselves, or simply just to put on a show for people in Roman society to watch of past glory battles and where they'd actually won, to just recreations, so to speak. And again, this would push forth this idea of patriotism and nationalism that Romans thoroughly enjoyed. And so finally, we have one of the last elements of the Colosseum, and that was, of course, execution. And a major part of these executions were the use of Christians. Now, the Roman Empire itself would eventually convert to Christianity, but as many know, its initial roots was pagan. And so when you start to think of Christianity, a group that, they have one God, one man, this made them excellent fodder, so to speak, for these games and for these executions. And so it would not be uncommon at one point in Roman history for any kind of mob situation at all, regardless if it had anything to do with the matter, to mob chance to eventually shift over to that of Christians to the lions. What we have here in this next picture, this is basically just what we'd have here is a gladiator standing over his defeated opponent, and he's looking up to the crowd. He's enjoying, his accolades, his praise of what he's going to receive, and also he's looking to basically, in ancient Rome, in these games, they would either give a thumbs down or a thumbs up, and then this would basically ultimately decide whether or not his fallen opponent should live or die. So for the actual architecture of the Colosseum itself, its dimensions were 617 feet long by 524 feet wide by 200 feet tall. Inside of the Colosseum itself, the areas in which the citizens would actually seat, these would be rounded marble benches. This was referred to as the cavea. To give you a better understanding, just think of the inside of a football stadium, how your rows that are closest to the ground are the smallest, and then as you move upward and outward of the stadium, it gets a little bit, the rows get a little bit bigger and they get a little bit higher. That way, people sitting behind can see down and over the people in front of them. And so the arena itself had 76 entrances, and this basically allowed for people who had their tickets, whether they were coming into the arena or leaving, it allowed people to get to their seats very quickly and hopefully with as little confusion as possible. And so there were estimations that basically said, regardless of how many people were inside of the arena, if you had a fully packed stadium, they'd be able to exit the entire stadium and have the entire place cleared within 5 minutes. And as far as actual seating arrangements where people would sit, your first front row would obviously be the closest to the action. This would be for your senatorial classes, your aristocrats. And then finally, as you would move backwards, it would go by your hierarchical status in society. So you'd have your higher upper echelon of people in society sitting behind the senators, and it would go all the way up to the top where you'd have your slaves, your poor. And oftentimes, when women were allowed to come in and watch, they'd have to sit up at the top. For the actual Colosseum itself, because of how massive it was and the actual complexity of many of the things within the Colosseum, whether it be the vaults that were beneath it, the actual stairways that were within the Colosseum to get to the different levels of it, it relied heavily upon specific types of rock that could handle the intense weight that was above it. And so these specific materials include the use of what is referred to as special travertine. This was used to encase and support the quote-unquote skeleton of the building. Volcanic stones, specifically peperino and tufa, which were both used for inner walls and upper parts of the Colosseum. And then finally concrete, and then this would be used to create and support the vaults that would be beneath the Colosseum. And then aside from actually just being vaults, these vaults would serve as support structures for the seating arrangements above it, because if you're thinking, I've got 80,000 people above sitting in the Colosseum, we need something massive beneath it to make sure it doesn't all fall in on itself. And so as far as the remaining portions of the Colosseum, aside from those materials, from an architectural standpoint, it placed a heavy emphasis on uses of things like arches, on columns, on entablatures, and this would basically all of these, and these would all be interwoven together to create as much support as the Colosseum needed. This would all go around the Colosseum and make sure that it held upright, and as we can see today, despite the fact that it has some damage, it's held through weather, through pillaging, through things like that. And so finally, one of the most important things about the Colosseum to understand is beneath the Colosseum itself at a plain sight were vaults that existed, and these vaults themselves, they could include things, we had your livestock, it could be, your ferocious beasts, your tigers, your lions, actual gladiators themselves, maybe preparing for battle, places for them to sleep and wait, because these shows could go on for days. And then finally, even places where you could keep dead bodies, because when we're talking about these fantastical events, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of dead bodies, so you needed somewhere to keep them all. And so what was actually incredible about these vaults, and what leads to why the Colosseum is so impressive, is these vaults themselves were actually fitted with counterweights, and these systems that ultimately interwove them all into this basically elevator system that can move these vaults from beneath the Colosseum up onto the floor itself in order to move certain things around for whatever show it is you were trying to display at the time.